Okay, so for our next video clip, we're going to talk a little bit about autoimmune diseases and then immunodeficiencies. So what are autoimmune diseases? Auto means self. So this is where you are inappropriately making immune responses against your own tissues. And now these can also involve hypersensitivity. So hypersensitivities can involve reactions to things that are foreign to your body, like poison ivy or red blood cells that have been donated to you because you need a blood donation. But in other cases, those hypersensitivities can be inappropriately directed to your own self-antigens. So there is some overlap here between what we talked about with hypersensitivity and these autoimmune diseases. So these can involve autoantibodies. Those are going to be antibodies that attach to your own self molecules or antigens, or T cells that react to your own antigens, or both can occur. But sometimes these are actually triggered because there are molecules on microbes that are really close in terms of their 3D shapes to human molecules. A really good example of that is, I don't see it on the chart over here from your textbook, but if you've ever heard of somebody developing rheumatic fever due to a strep infection, so Streptococcus pyogenes causes strep throat, and in some cases, so there are molecules, antigens on Streptococcus pyogenes bacteria that look very similar to molecules on your heart valves. And so some people will generate antibodies to those Streptococcus bacterial antigens that wind up attaching to their heart valves and causing an immune reaction, an immune response targeted against the heart valves. And when that happens, you have heart valve damage associated with that. That's called rheumatic fever. It's not a very fun thing to experience. Many examples of autoimmune diseases. So we already talked about lupus, which stands for systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE. That's the clinical term for it. Erythema refers to redness. Because people have lupus, they get those immune complexes we talked about in the last video clip deposited in the basement membrane underneath the epidermis, and that triggers in inflammation, and the redness is coming from the inflammation that occurs there. But they also get inflammation in many other organs as well, as those antibody-antigen complexes get deposited. So that's an example of an autoimmune disease that involves type 3 hypersensitivity. You make antibodies inappropriately to a number of things. So it's kind of like that clonal deletion that's supposed to occur that we talked about in the bone marrow and in the thymus, where these B cells and T cells don't get out if they react to your own self-antigens. That doesn't seem to work very well in these types of patients, or not as well as it's supposed to. So they actually make antibodies against their own blood cells, platelets, clotting factors, DNA. You make antibodies against your own DNA, so it's a very unusual disease. Rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis, if you've ever heard of that before, which involves bone tissues, occurs across the entire body, and actually involves types 2, 3, and 4. So you've got antibody problems and T-cell problems involved when you have your joints being attacked by the immune system as part of rheumatoid arthritis. Graves' disease, if you've heard of that before, when you took Biology 202, that's where the thyroid is involved, and you make antibodies that attach to the receptors on the follicular cells in the thyroid that bind thyroid stimulating hormone. So these antibodies mimic thyroid stimulating hormone, which tells your thyroid to crank out lots and lots and lots of thyroid hormone. So you guys learn about that when you take Biology 202. Myasthenia gravis is an immune disorder that involves antibodies that attach to the acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction. Remember, those are the receptors on your skeletal muscle fibers that receive acetylcholine signals from motor neurons. And so when that happens, the motor neurons can't communicate with the skeletal muscle fibers and tell them to contract. So you can have problems with muscle contraction. Type 1 diabetes is believed to be a type 4 hypersensitivity, where you have T cells that attack the beta cells in the pancreas that make your insulin. Multiple sclerosis involves type 2 and type 4 hypersensitivities, T cells and antibodies that attack the myelin sheathing that coats the axons of your neurons. Hopefully some of this stuff sounds familiar to you if you've had biology 201 and 202. So you can see that these are these autoimmune diseases involve immune responses against your own self-antigens, and they work through hypersensitivity reactions of some type. All right, how about immunodeficiencies? So immunodeficiencies can be primary immunodeficiencies. That's where they're genetic. They're due to genetic mutations that you generally will inherit. Secondary immunodeficiencies are acquired. So primary immunodeficiencies, there's a number of those. So some people have B cell defects. So they may have functional T cells, but they just don't have good functioning B cells. So they're not going to make antibodies well. Or they might have T cell defects. Or you can have, there's a type of immunodeficiency called SCID, which is severe combined immunodeficiency disorder. And they essentially have almost no functioning immune system. Like the Bubble Boy over here, maybe you have seen movies or documentaries about the Bubble Boy, not the funny movie from the 80s, I guess it was, but the actual Bubble Boy, who was very well known back in I guess it was the 1970s when I was a kid. And so he had this severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome, and he had to live inside plastic tinning to make sure that he was never exposed to any outside microorganisms, because he had basically no functioning immune system to fight them off. And there are people who have complement defects, so they can still fight off infections, but because they lack that complement system, it takes them longer to clear infections. I think especially bacterial infections. So those are genetic disorders that you inherit. Secondary immunodeficiencies are acquired. Probably the most famous example would be HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. This kills your helper T cells, which cripples a great part of your immune system, since those helper T cells are so vital. They help B cells make their responses. They help other T cells make their responses. They stimulate your phagocytic cells to do phagocytosis better. So when you lose those cells, you're in big trouble. Nutritional deficiencies, stress. When you're pregnant, you're immunodeficient. As you get older, you become immunodeficient as your immune system just doesn't work as well anymore. You can't produce those B and T cells and other white blood cells as quickly as you used to be able to do so. If you've been exposed to radiation, any kind of immunosuppressive drugs, like let's say, when you get a lung transplant, heart transplant, something like that, they generally put you on drugs that suppress your immune system so that your immune system doesn't attack those donated tissues. Or if you lose your spleen, that's your blood filtering organ that helps you generate immune reactions. That's going to leave you with an immunodeficiency as well. So for the last video clip for chapter 14, we're going to home in on a really important type of secondary immunodeficiency, and that is going to be infection with human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which leads to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. And that'll wind up being our last video clip for chapter 14 and unit 4.